Everyone has a source sheet? Okay, excellent. So no Bibles this week. This will feel like a very different class than last week for those of you who were here or watched it. This class is really a kind of bridge from what we did last week to what we're going to be doing next week. And just to give you a heads up, I guess a plug for next week, what we're going to be doing in next week's class is thinking more locally about the Yom HaZikaron ceremony that we do in this school as a test case for gathering ideas about what has been done, what could be done. Those of you who were here last week know that I just wrote a paper about the subject, and so it's an active topic right now, and the school is currently thinking about what kinds of outcomes we're looking for and better ways to structure the day. So we're going to be watching some clips and talking about them. It'll be more like a workshop atmosphere. And today we need to take ourselves from the Pesach Seder to the SAR Yom HaZikaron ceremony. So it's kind of a big task ahead. I'm a little nervous, I must admit. Theoretical task of bridging and also kind of reorienting ourselves to a different type of learning. So let me just give us a sense of where we were last week, what we spoke about, what's still on the table, and how we're going to get ourselves to the Yom HaZikaron ceremony. I wrote some notes, pardon if I'm reading, I just want to make sure I get it all in. In our first class, we spoke about the Pesach Seder as the formative model for memory making and commemoration in the Jewish tradition. We explored the deep roots of storytelling that are encoded within the original account of the Exodus, and we asked ourselves, what really is the purpose in all this telling? Why is this holiday, above all others, made into a telling event? We have, as we said, several foundational moments at our nation's core, not the least of which is Matan Torah. And only the story of our slavery and redemption from Egypt is made into a holiday with the command to tell and retell year after year. We did lots of things after we raised that question, but I'm cutting to the end where we both deepened and answered the question by looking at that set of mitzvot, all centering around kind of social justice moments where the Exodus story served as the basis for those mitzvot. It deepened the question because we realized that this imperative to tell and make the story a part of our Jewish consciousness is not just located in that one night a year Seder event, but is part and parcel of how we behave as Jews every day. But we use it as an answer or a partial answer or a possible answer to the question by showing us that telling the story is not just about parent-child dialogue, it's not just about drawing closer bonds among our family on this very nostalgic night, but telling and owning our story is important to help shape us as a people. We said specifically that these type of mitzvot that are connected to Mitzrayim help us see ourselves as capable of, but not willing to become Egyptians. Does this sound familiar for those who were here? I hope so. Choosing to live a life at God's command as the Jewish people means that we're committing ourselves to a way of life that will allow us to be free of silent or small acts of oppression, like delaying giving wages to our workers, and free, this is a little poetic, to be aware of the fundamental fiction of living with power, and to participate in a weekly reenactment of the truths of being human, that we are all created with equality, and that we are all workers for God's world. What mitzvah was that? That was Shabbat, right? Shabbat. So in broad strokes, what we saw last week is that all this telling has a very distinct purpose. And that purpose is to shape ourselves as a certain kind of people who are aware of the instincts of being a human being and living with all kinds of others, but setting ourselves up within the system of halakha to safeguard us from falling into Paro's trap, so to speak. Okay, that was last week. What I had asked us to do last week, and we didn't quite get there, although we got close, was to be able to draw out of that discussion what are the critical ingredients that make the Seder so powerful that we might be able to take with us in thinking about these more modern events. And I just want to say this, that feels like a hard thing to do, to pull out those ingredients, but we did it, so I'm going to show you what we did. And the second part, to go from Leil HaSeder to thinking about a ceremony is like, right, the distance is so vast. Not the least of which, we're not talking about creating a ceremony. We're not in that position, but we are noticing what the ceremonies that we participate in are like, what they might try to do, and how they work. So if we think about the Pesach Seder and the ingredients of what make it that night, and I can't forget what happened in this room last week when we spoke about what was the Seder like for us, or what was the story that was being told. It's a good reminder for all of us. Turn off your phones. My children, whenever they do gymnastic skits, they always begin by saying, "Please turn off your cell phones," which is kind of depressing that they know to say that, but it's true. All right, so where was I? When we in the room were recalling, last week it was a little bit more close, our experience at the Seder and what people said in this room about what the Seder was for them. Remember, we noticed that it wasn't about the story of origin. It was about so many other things that have been and continue to be important to us wherever we are in our lives, mostly in terms of our family and our tradition. Right? So what are the ingredients that make the Pesach Seder so alive, so powerful, so impactful? So the first one we've already said, or maybe I've forced us into saying that, which is that there's a pragmatic purpose or a pragmatic focus. Right? And that pragmatic focus is what we just spoke about in terms of the purposefulness, the ability to shape us into a people. We saw that also, if you recall, when we looked at the Bikurim ceremony, which was the earliest rendition within the Bible itself of retelling the story of the Exodus in order to create a certain mentality. And that mentality was, I, an Israelite farmer, is not just grateful to God for giving me this abundance, but I'm connected to this larger narrative. That's a pragmatic focus to retelling the story. And I told you that Yerushalmi calls that the intersection of ritual and recital in the service of memory. So if ingredient number one is pragmatic focus, that's what makes it work. We're nowhere on the sheets yet. You could argue with me and say, what? My Seder was not about that. My Seder was not about teaching us how to be not Egyptians, right? Would anyone agree with that protest? Like, if you're telling me, Tammy, that the purpose of the Jewish people obsessively telling this story through mitzvot, through performance, through dialogue with children, is about teaching ourselves not to become Egyptians, that's never come up for me. Would anyone raise their hand to that? Like, that feels like a foreign conclusion? Or a stretch, maybe? Okay? In fact, I thought... No? Riley's looking at me suspiciously. Go ahead.
I think that while it's true that it of itself doesn't come up, I think there's so many ingredients in the Seder that are building blocks so that conclusion can come at other times, but the building blocks are all in the Seder.
Okay, so it's potentially there, but maybe it didn't emerge this year or explicitly?
Or maybe it's just a narrow definition of what we're trying not to become, saying Egyptian as opposed to sort of a more global concept of what we call people.
Okay, what would you say more globally?
Well, I think it's, we talked about last week, power versus powerless, good versus evil, and those are sort of I think it's pretty apparent in the Seder that those are ideas that are focused on empathy, protecting the powerless, helping not to fall into that pattern, making sure that we are being protected with that and being aware of your power and how you use it. So.
Right. Which we could almost make that, as interesting, your reaction, that calling that Egypt could make that feel like, no, Egypt can't contain all those things. Or Egypt could be either way. But Deb is saying, no, that actually does feel right, that you call it something else, but that's what we're talking about, right? So I could tell you, I've been at Seders where the dominant theme, if you will, that would come out is actually very different, which would be, we live with suffering all the time. I think I mentioned this last week, right? Being in a Seder with survivors, the dominant theme was B'chol Dor V'Dor. And the dominant theme was actually we're vulnerable. And the Pesach Seder, and my husband is a historian of Marano, so we have that whole other valence of what now a Seder can be in the open. We are celebrating our freedom. We're celebrating our lack of powerlessness, right? You could really see it going in lots of directions. So when that happens, I'm really curious about, I guess I would call this ingredient number 2, I'm skipping ahead, but the balance between structure and openness at the Pesach Seder. And you could come in as a pedagogue or even as a family member and say that's what makes it work, or you could say that's what makes it fail. If everybody could walk out of their Seder, or everybody almost imagine like we could look in all these houses at the same time, and the same kind of purpose does not emerge, you could look at that and say, well, that's a fail. If we're supposed to emerge from this night really aware of how close we could always be to become Egyptians, and my family ends up talking about something totally different, well then the structure isn't set up to achieve that goal. Or you could say, it's like everything in Jewish tradition, the fact that we have multiple possibilities and this narrative is so compelling that so many different people, I think you said last week, there's something for everyone, or someone else did, right? That's part of what makes it so viable and vital. You don't have to decide. I'm still thinking about that, right? The structure and the openness, the elasticity of the Pesach Seder, and yet the very pragmatic focus at the same time.
Well, the differences actually, as long as you're different than the Egyptians,
Right.
you can be different in different ways and walk out with different messages.
Right, and so the differences could lead you to, well, it's really a night about boundaries, or it's a night about identity, or it's a night about really figuring out who we are as a people. And boundaries, as we know from the political scene, could take you in different directions. You could focus on who's outside or who's inside. Right, so, and again, that might not be a bad thing, and at different times, that's kind of the Seder too. In different eras, there are different stories that we need to upplay and different stories that we need to downplay. This might be a moment, some could argue in the Jewish community, we should be upplaying the inside of our boundaries, and others would look at it in the other way and say, we have to make sure that we safeguard those boundaries from outsiders. The other thing that we noticed as an important ingredient, of course, is that the Pesach Seder is not a standalone event. There is the supporting structure of the whole year, whether it's through the Shema, whether it's through the mitzvot, whether it's through, actually, I think about in the school, how we study the stories of the Exodus. It's not this one time of the year you show up and suddenly you're encountering the story, which is supposed to be so transformative for your family and for the people. You're living it all the time. That might be another reason why we can so readily engage with the story and we can have it do all the magic that it does. And the last thing I'll say as an ingredient is the multiple generations together with the full body experience. Right? We said this last week. I think I said smells and tastes, and somebody said, no, that's not the most important part. But I disagree. I think the fact that we eat during the ceremony and we're dressed up, and some of us change our clothes during the Seder, right? And costuming and the kind of all the activities, the full body sensory experience that happens at the Seder is part of why it's so memorable and part of why it works. Okay, that's a lot of ingredients. That's enough. If there's others, we're just going to leave them to the side. So just to review, we have the purpose-driven, we have the supporting structure, we have multiple generations, full experience, and the balance between the structure and the looseness. Okay, so what do we do with all of that? How do we take that forward if we're going to start looking at, again, fast forward to events of recent Jewish history that, and I said this last week, the reason why it's important to put Pesach in this conversation with Yom HaZikaron is not just because Pesach is the formative event for memory making. It's also because Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut were thoughtfully placed within the arc of Pesach. I don't know if you're aware of this. I wasn't until I started doing this research, but Yom HaZikaron, first of all, was a later development. Right? First there was Yom HaAtzmaut. Okay, so you all knew that. I didn't know that. Yom HaZikaron only became a thing in 1963. Right? It was an official day, and originally it was like a piece of Yom HaAtzmaut. It was an hour or two assembly, and by the way, this is interesting for next week's conversation, most of the thinking about how to celebrate and structure the days was happening in schools, right? And in a state like the state of Israel, where the schools are part of the government, right, and of course kids are the recipients of all the messages, so it makes sense why all those things happened. But the Yom HaZikaron ceremony was originally happening within Yom HaAtzmaut in schools, and then it was actually bereaved parents who petitioned to have it be its own day, and was specifically placed for all kinds of symbolic reasons, right before Yom HaAtzmaut. But Yom HaAtzmaut was also chosen to be right after Pesach, okay? And we'll pick up with that next week, but already think about why that's so significant as a Jew, and maybe we don't feel it as strongly here, but certainly if you've ever been in Israel during this season, there's a sense of having kind of lived through the arc of slavery and redemption, which is in the long past, but we're asked to bring it at the Seder into our current. And then you have these days which seem to have the same themes, right? With Yom HaShoah, of course, being a very important spot in that arc of slavery to redemption, but it gets moved now into, well, if you're religious, you still locate God in that conversation. If you're not, that it actually gets placed into the hands of human beings. But that redemptive arc is now all now. It's all in the historical present. Okay, and next week we're going to talk about how different that will feel for diaspora kids or for ourselves if we are sensitive to that, or if we're not sensitive to that, what ends up happening to Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut. Okay, let's do a little reading to get us to go that arc. Problem with being a teacher during a class here, I can't talk to those kids. Okay, so the first paragraph that you have here, I think I mentioned Yosef Yerushalmi last week, his very important book, Zachor, which I can't believe how many times I've read and reread, although the words don't change, but my sense of them keep changing. It's a fabulous book, very important kind of personal book that he wrote towards the end of his life. He was one of the foremost historians in America, Jewish historians, and he wrote about the writing of history. And he speaks in this opening chapter about how Jews fundamentally are not historians by orientation, despite the fact that we are obsessed with memory. And he creates a real distinction between the writing of history and the creation or cultivation of memory. He says here, the biblical appeal to remember thus has little to do with curiosity about the past. Israel is told only that it must be a kingdom of priests and a holy people. Nowhere is it suggested that it become a nation of historians. Memory is, by its nature, selective, and the demand that Israel remember is no exception. The fact that history has meaning does not mean that everything that happened in history is meaningful or worthy of recollection. Of Menashe of Yehuda, a powerful king who reigned for 55 years in Jerusalem, we hear only that he, quote, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And only the details of that evil are conveyed to us. Not only is Israel under no obligation whatever to remember the entire past, but its principle of selection is unique unto itself. It is above all God's active intervention in history and man's responses to them, be they positive or negative, that must be recalled. Nor is the invocation of memory actuated by the normal and praiseworthy desire to preserve heroic national deeds from oblivion. Ironically, many of the biblical narratives seem almost calculated to deflate the national pride. For the real danger is not so much that what happened in the past will be forgotten as the more crucial aspect of how it happened. And the example that he brings right after one is the example of the Bikurim, which we already mentioned. The importance, and this is related back to Pesach, the importance is not to remember all the details of what happened. Notice, by the way, at Leil HaSeder, what we don't do. We don't open up the Chumash and just read all the way through, right? Where would you even start, by the way, right? Would you start with Shemot? Would you start at the end of Breshit? But we don't do that. The important thing is not that everybody leaves and there's like no checklist, exit exam, cute little iPad game where you make sure everyone got all the details. The importance of telling the story, right, is what you do with it and the selectivity. Okay. Anything come out from that passage? I started talking right away. I didn't give you space to think. Anything new in that paragraph where it actually resonates with what we've been saying?
Well, I think
Yeah, go ahead.
the comment about deflating the national pride as opposed to sort of creating these historical things that elevate is sort of the antithesis of what in our minds see.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Why?
Well, because I sort of feel like the events of the Seder lead up to this grand exit and redemption and all of that. And that's a grand thing.
Right, except that if you probe a little bit further, and it's so interesting that you say that, because if you look for, let's say, the stories that personally sustain me when I come around to the story of Exodus every year, when I think about the Midrashim, about the women who were heroic in very mundane kinds of ways, all of the anonymous heroes, that doesn't make its way into the Seder. And so you don't necessarily walk away from the Seder feeling great about the Jews, right? You come away feeling great about God's power or God's maybe selection of the Jews, but I think it's consonant, right? Like, we tell the story not to, you might think we should have a day for each Gibor, we should have a day to commemorate Moshe and what he gave. It's actually not what we do. We don't remember heroes in that way. Yeah.
All history is like that. I mean, the South has a different history in the Civil War than the North does. The Democrats see American history much different than conservative Republicans. We always pick what we want.
100%, right? So history is always selective. That's obvious. That's not that's not just about Jews and how we celebrate. Correct. But what he's pointing out, which is different, I think, is that what's sort of paradoxical about the ways in which we remember, or the ways in which we're commanded to remember, are not the things that you would have expected if you think that what people want to remember is the heroes, or how great we were, what we accomplished. Actually, the things we remember are largely about God. And the add-on here, like the Bikurim, what he means by deflate the national pride in this particular context is for you to know, as a farmer even, don't feel like you're so great. You need to be reminded, in fact, that all the time you live with the risk of amnesia about God. So it's not your kochiva utzem yadi. It's not about what you've done. It's about God. Yeah.
I think a good example is the same story that we interpret one way, the flood story, and which the Babylonians interpret another way about the role of God.
Right.
In the Babylonian story, the cause of the flood was the fact that people were making too much noise and bothering their gods.
Right.
And it had totally no morality in that at all. And we obviously are influenced by that story, but we put our own spin on it.
Right.
And the spin is morality.
Right.
That people were not behaving, they weren't doing the right thing, and this is why God created a flood.
Good.
So it's...
I'm just to interrupt you because it's off topic, although it's a wonderful example that documents relating to the same kind of event can put a spin that's important to the audience with particular messages. So we know that, we own that, we've seen that. Right? What I want to add to this conversation, thank you, is if we're now saying, though, if we go back to ingredient number 1, and we're comfortable with that, we know that, there should be a purpose. It's not just about recalling details. That's for a history class. Even there, it's not about just the facts. I want to just introduce a word to caution us a little bit when we get to a kind of purpose-driven telling or recounting or commemoration.
Message.
The danger is that the message could become too limited or too didactic, that we then run into the danger of it being an instrumentalization, which means that you're using the history in order to really say something else. And I want to give an example. This is not of instrumentalization exactly, but it comes close. Many years ago, when I was earlier in teaching here, I went to a seminar run by an organization called Facing History in Ourselves. Anyone familiar with it? A wonderful organization that provides resources to teachers of all different settings that are based in Holocaust education, but towards teaching people, not necessarily Jewish kids, all kinds of American kids, about messages countering bullying and other kinds of oppression and persecution, but it's generated in the memory of the Holocaust. And I had such a mixed feeling when I was in this, being familiar with these resources, because on the one hand I thought, this is great. This is doing, we have so much sadness and we have so much loss, and what do I do with that? So this is saying there's something you could do with that. You can be an or legoyim, you can actually use your experience towards helping other people. But the grandchild of survivors in me said, but that's instrumentalizing, or it feels like it might be instrumentalizing the Holocaust towards other problems that we face, and does that cheapen or diminish, right? I'm on tape, so I hope nobody from that organization sees this. It's phenomenal, but it raises that question, right? And what's the boundaries? How much do you want the message to be crystal clear, take home, kids, right? Bridgington next week could come away and say, I got it. And how much are you nervous that if you do that, number one, it might change, right? For the people who lived through it, it might be too much of a takeaway, and it might narrow it too much, and then we're far away from our model of the Seder. There's not something for everyone. It's so clear that you either take it or you leave it. Okay, so I'm putting that out there. We're getting closer to Yom HaZikaron. The next piece that I want to put in, and then we're going to have a little activity. Here is another quote from a book that I read for this paper by Don Handelman, who's an Israeli scholar. It's called Models and Mirrors Towards an Anthropology of Public Events. And what he's going to add to the conversation, and we'll read it in a minute, is we're not just in this conversation talking about why do we remember certain things and what do we want others to do with that memory. What happens when that moment of memory making gets concretized into a public event or a ceremony? Okay, so we could all say, but he's going to say it better than us, right? What happens when a public event is the filter through which those memories are nurtured, cultivated, and shaped? He says, public events are locations of communication that convey participants into versions of social order in relatively coherent ways. As the flow of living so often is not, public events are put together to communicate comparatively well-honed messages. If the flow of mundane living may be quite uncertain in terms of direction and outcomes, the converse is true of public events. In the extreme case, they are operators of and on social order. Not only may they affect social order, but they may also, that should be effect it. They, public events, are culturally designed forms that select out, concentrate, and interrelate themes of existence, lived and imagined, that are more diffused, dissipated, and obscured in the everyday. Okay, that actually sounds a little too academic for me now that I'm reading it out loud. But what do you take away from that? What does he make clear about a public event?
A public event is designed to actually maybe in a sequential way, in a very clear way, bring you to a certain conclusion. Life throws it at you much more randomly, and you have to create your own order.
Okay, good. Right? So it's organized. There's again, what we were just talking about, the kind of take-home message. And he also, maybe not so well in this piece, but elsewhere, really talks about how public events are not just happening within the state, so to speak, but they are part of creating the norms of the state. And so the state, in our case, we're not a state, and we're talking about our school, but in Israel, we are talking about a state. The ways in which citizens or members of a social group understand what the social group expects of it are often communicated in a public event. Right?
It's about community.
Correct. And we also know this to be true, and I did lots of interviews of students, which I'll share with you next week, but we also know that people remember the messages that they hear at a public event very differently from what they receive in a class, a conversation, a gradual, right? Even though we think change happens as an educator, I believe very strongly that lasting change only happens through a very slow process of learning. But the kind of powerful, especially, and now I'll add a word, affective or emotional encounter happens most effectively at a public event. And so that really raises the question of what are we trying to do in these public events? What are the messages? What are the historical messages? What are the purpose, as we said, purposeful, pragmatic focus? What are we trying to do when it comes to Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut? Okay, before I share with you a little bit of what I think, I would love to get your ideas. This is the same question I asked the students. Don't think too hard. What do you think? There'll be two questions. One is, what do you think the goal of a Yom HaZikaron ceremony is? And you can answer based on, if you haven't been to one in a long time, try to remember one that you were in. If it was in America or in Israel, take note of that. And if you've been to both, then maybe answer differently. What do you think the goal of a Yom HaZikaron ceremony is? And secondly, what do you remember feeling in the ceremony? Okay? Everyone's so thoughtful. Okay, so when you share your thoughts, they don't have to be finished in writing. I'll collect them at the end. I'm really curious. If I end up using them in my paper in the edits, I'll let you know. I'll quote you with your name. Answer whether you are saying this based on which place you experienced the tekes, whether here or in Israel. And if you could, maybe it'll be after a couple of people speak, to think about what made you say that. Where in the ceremony did you get the idea that this was the goal? Okay, I'm just really curious. As there's no manual when you come in. Here's the goal, let's hope it works. It only comes from what we experience, and sometimes we're actually wrong as to what the goal was. I'll tell you one story just to break the ice, and then I want to hear what you have to say. When I was in camp, and I've told Rabbi Harkstack this story many times, it's strange that I'm still thinking about it because I was maybe 14. But it was almost Tisha B'Av, and in camp they asked us to write down our deepest thoughts and concerns. They told us somebody was going to the Kotel before Tisha B'Av, and they would put all of our notes in the wall. And I'll never forget this. Going into a corner, I was one of those serious kids, and I wrote down everything that was on my mind. And a friend of mine somebody was I think sick in her family, and really poured everything into this petek. They took all of our notes. I don't want to tell you what happened. They put it into a bag and they lit it on fire. And they said to us, this was the end of the pu'ula, they said, and we were all crying, and they said, you feel so sad, and all you did was write down your hopes, desires, imagine future. Now you can have a small appreciation for what it was like to lose everything in the time of the Chorban. And at the time, I said to my counselor, what? Why did you do that? And she said to me, you know what? You're never going to forget it. So I didn't, but I always come back to that as, is that the mark of a successful program if you don't forget it, right? Their intended outcome at that time was to create an impression. I think that was if they had sat down and written their lesson plan, we want them to feel something very deeply. That story, gnaws at me when I think about responsible, emotionally laden education that we do for our kids. We got to do better, right? It can't be simply feel something very, very deeply and then perhaps maybe scarred for the next, several decades. All right. You want to start us off, Deb? Okay. What'd you say?
So I thought about what you said because certainly as a child, as a student who went to SAR, I think the goal of those programs in general was to sort of create this feeling of Zionism, of love for Israel, this courageous country that fought through it all and so forth. And over the years, it's obviously changed for me. My son was in the Israeli army. He fought in Gaza, lost friends. And I think, when you experience that, even as limited as my experience was, it made me appreciate more what it's like for those families, for people, first of all, know what it's like for the people of Israel. Because I sit here in my relative comfort and freedom and protection under the protection of the people who are there standing at the wall. And so I think that for me now, the ceremony is absolutely about appreciating the sacrifice of the parents of Israel, of the children, the boys and young men and women of Israel. And it's a completely different feel for me. And I think less about Zionism, even though that's the underlying feeling. I think for me, it's really meant to be this collective empathy for these families. It's a communal, it's reminding everybody has a child who goes to the army in Israel, but some people sacrifice more in their loss. And I think it's a way to happen for everybody. People go in Israel, they live their life every day and under all this difficulty, but they do it and they live it with a smile on their face and they go to work and they do everything. And this is a day to say, let's take a step back and remember the blood, sweat, and tears of what it took to be here and the people who really ultimately sacrificed their life. And that for me is what the ceremony is about. I don't even think about Zionism or the existence of Israel. That's sort of an underlying thing. It's really about how community comes together for people who are grieving.
It's so helpful. Your response is so helpful because you took us like through your childhood, through how your life and perspective has changed. Maybe the ceremony itself hasn't changed, right? And that's, by the way, part of the power of ceremony, that it's not supposed to change. We know what to expect, and we fall into like a similar emotional corridor, so to speak, but you come to it with such different ideas and emotions that you've almost shaped it for yourself, right? Awesome. Someone else want to share? Yeah.
I would just like to stand with what Debbie said. I have grandchildren who live in Israel, and one of my grandsons is a very big runner, and he's
A very big what?
Runner.
Runner.
And he's coming in a 5, 10K, whatever the whole thing is. He runs fast, and I just always thought it was very nice. It's good exercise. And then I was listening to someone speak not about him in general, and said these kids want to they're running because they want to be fit to be in the highest level of the army. And like something clutched my heart, that's what this is all about, to become the best soldier you can be.
Yeah. And that highlights for you really, and we're already getting there, but the diaspora Israel piece is huge here. And it's even hard for us to have a conversation about Yom HaZikaron without talking about the layers of connection and disconnection that we feel from Israel. And all of us in different ways have that. You clearly, right, it's both of you in a much more connected way, but some of the symbols, I'm building on what you said, some of the symbols of Israeli life we miss, right? Even in your story, like and one of the questions that I want us to ask next week is, what should we be doing for kids here? What are our obligations? One way of framing the Yom HaZikaron ceremony is that we're trying to give kids as much of a glimpse and a sense of what it's like there, but peering in, and there are certain upsides and downsides to that. So we're going to explore that, but thank you. Yeah.
I was at the academy a couple
Yeah.
of years ago, and Gili brought me up front because I walk with a cane, and he sat me next to Israeli soldiers who were visiting as they showed the films of the families who have lost sons and daughters. And I just remember sitting there and crying and looking at these young people, and I finally turned to them and said, "May God be with you, that you are safe when you go back."
Yeah.
It was just so powerful watching it with them and knowing that they were going back.
Right. And in Israeli schools, what I've come to understand, where there are many, the Yom HaZikaron, one of the things I hear often from Israeli teachers who work here is that Yom HaZikaron, maybe for us is a lot in that 1 hour, ceremony, but it's nothing compared to what Yom HaZikaron feels like in Israel, where there's nothing normal going on that day at all. And there's so many places where Yom HaZikaron is felt and actualized and memorialized. But in the school is still an important place where there is a tekes, and the parents of the bereaved parents of soldiers who went to that school all come back every year to the high school. And so the high school students are sitting there with the parents of the kids who used to go there. And so the connection, what you just mentioned, the connection that you felt, to those soldiers, the kids sitting in the tekes in Israel are feeling not only through the parents, but also it's reflecting on them, right? Because they're all going od ma'at to the army. So again, the symbolic structures that are in place in Israel are, really very different than what we have here. Yeah, what do you want to say?
To me, something very impressive is, which I see on television, is when the siren sounds and everything stops. All the traffic stops and everybody gets out and gives it a minute of silence. And it's so it sort of like gets into you because this is such it's a simple tribute, but it's terrific. I mean,
Right.
It's such a great ceremony. It's such a great remembrance. It's like, it really moves me every year.
And we'll talk about this next week, but we watch or listen to the siren in Israel, right? Which brings you close and makes you feel far away at the same time, right?
But there's that sense of pride of being part of the only nation that does this.
Yep.
Before they have the big party,
Yep.
they remember how they got there and
Yep.
the sacrifices.
Yep. Yeah, Ronnie.
A story came to mind when they were evacuating Gush Katif. So it was a different kind of agreement, a different kind of sacrifice. I heard a speech by somebody who was involved in the planning, because they knew in advance that they were going to be removing people against their will. And this one person said, we need to declare that every coffee shop in the land of Israel closes for the period of time that we'll be engaged in this very precise taking out of people from their homes, so that everybody feels what only those people are really feeling. And to my mind, that's the echo of what's Yom HaZikaron and stopping for the siren makes us become a part of the experience that other people are happening, so that it goes deeper inside. And by the way, that never happened, even though I see the brilliance in the idea that everybody in Israel needs to recognize that there were people sacrificing at that moment.
Okay, you just segued for me beautifully to the next, just turn the page for a second, okay? I'm going to collect. I really want to hear what you all have to say. If you look at number 3, this shows you that this is a source book put together in 2017. The next 2 are Facebook posts that I read on Yom HaZikaron. The first is from a dear friend of mine who is also a professor at Bar Ilan, and this is what she posted with a translation of a quote from a widow that now that I've paid attention, the Hebrew version has been circulating also in lots of places this year. But she wrote, on the eve, this is my friend writing, of Israel's Memorial Day, when so many cultural forces, especially in the education of our children, push in the direction of sacralizing loss and glorifying heroic deaths, here is an alternative approach. An army widow says, especially if you are fortunate enough not to have lost ones, don't be sad. Be afraid enough that you get to work changing the direction of the future. And these are her actual words in English. I beg you, all of you, do not wallow in sad movies about our lost loved ones. Leave that to us. For you, Yom HaZikaron should be a frightening day, not a sad one. Do not wallow in sorrow over the past, but be filled with fear for the future and also responsibility for the future. Because every one of you could wind up like us. Bereavement isn't sacred, and you don't need to hang it on the wall and honor it. Rather, you need to work to prevent it. That's very challenging, Ronnie, right? I mean, what you were saying and what Deb was saying, a lot of us are saying, is that Yom HaZikaron, what is powerful for us is that we're let in, or we feel not in a include me, but we want to know what that's like. It's empathy building. It's also giving us an awareness of what so many people are sacrificing for the country, for, if we include ourselves, for the Jewish people. And this widow is saying, don't go there. Don't go there. The people who need a day, like those original group of bereaved parents who said, give us a day when we can really memorialize our chayalim together, our children, they need it for that purpose. But she's saying to us, don't glorify, don't sacralize loss. You're not missing, okay? What you need to be a part of, she's saying, is figuring out how to be responsible for the future. What if Yom HaZikaron was a day where we, and maybe you can't do it without the lost piece, I don't know, but was a day where we focus our energies on educating ourselves, inspiring ourselves to join the fight. And by the way, and I'm going to, again, with the students, join the fight does not only mean join the army, right? And we're doing ourselves a disservice when we don't promote other ways of being responsible for the state of Israel. So can you imagine if Yom HaZikaron, this is like a radical suggestion. It's like so many things need to be changed in order for this to happen. But Yom HaZikaron culturally, and she's speaking to Israelis, but we can actually perhaps consider it for ourselves. Maybe Yom HaZikaron is sending some of the wrong messages. If we feel somehow overcome by emotion, we think that that's am I being too edgy here? Do you hear what I'm saying? It's sort of sacrilegious because we not only expect and anticipate, we grow from, we're expanded, we feel connected, we feel part of the unity of the Jewish people in the modern era on Yom HaZikaron. And this widow is saying there might be a really different way for us to go that could be more constructive and could help us collectively. And it would require really structuring the ceremony and the day very differently.
Lincoln said that at Gettysburg, that they make sure they didn't die in vain.
Yep. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting because I was feeling kind of guilty because I didn't think, I told you I've been impressed with Press Watch and stuff. When you asked me what I remember, I was remembering not Israel, but myself as an American Jew. That's what I was remembering. And what is my responsibility as an American Jew for the state of Israel, but also globally? And that's why I can't get Trump out of my mind at all. And I was thinking what to remember now is to correct the past, which is a past which is not so far gone, and to what can we do to correct it for the world, for Israel, for America, for ourselves, to correct the present, which is this terrible man, for the future. And what can we do as Jews to preserve the good that we have left, which can rapidly be destroyed.
So Shirley, some people will say to you,
You're
that's
not a good
really
Jew.
important. No, it's not about not being a good Jew, but that's not the day for it, right? And so you could say,
Well, maybe it
is
is
the day. Okay, yeah.
Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but to me, this is almost like a call to get politically involved and, to affect change. And to me, and this is probably a very minority view, but I think this is a very good message to Israelis living in Israel, but I feel, and again, this is just a totally personal opinion, I'm not really sure how much right American Jews have to make some of these decisions, unless, Deb's son did go to the army, but most of us, or many of us, are not living in Israel and are not personally sacrificing our lives or our children's lives. So I always have issues with people getting politically involved in things that might lead to other people losing their lives or their children's lives. So I think a message like this is a very good message and is an appropriate message, but I think really just in Israel, to Israelis, by Israelis, as opposed to Americans.
Okay, can we follow up with that for a minute? I think you're right. Okay, for sure. If we're talking about political responsibility, and American Jews, we feel rightfully humble and anxious about intervening. However, could we expand for a moment and think about responsibility beyond political involvement? Like I totally see where you
Right,
read
that's what I'm
that,
saying. I don't know if
right?
she
And
meant it
my
that way.
impression of this, because I've been thinking in this direction, so that's probably why I saw it, but that responsibility for the future of the Jewish people and for the future of the Jews in Israel, American Jews ought to find lots and lots and lots of ways. Okay, I'm like all jumbled in my head of what we're doing next, but what I think we need to be doing is thinking more productively and creatively about what Rabbi Harkstark has been talking about in our Siach group, which is the Jewish people, right? Like, what ends up happening is we get stuck in this modality of, listen, we call ourselves Zionists, right? I didn't ask for a show of hands, but in this school, we call ourselves Zionists. We are signed on to that. And most of us are staying here. Not all of us. Most of us are staying here. Is that an incomprehensible contradiction that we're just going to feel terrible about for some of us? But I think we could do better. There are ways of imagining what it means to be a responsible Jew living in Riverdale, 2017, a Zionist, proud, working towards the Jewish people, of which Israel is a piece and America is a piece. Now, does that counter against or Zion? No, it's not. We don't have to orient ourselves only as, right? Like, what can we do because Israel's there and we're not a part of it? What can we all be doing for each other? So I'll give you one example. I was thinking about because this is coming up with students, which we're going to talk about next week, although we keep talking about. When students say after the ceremony, they feel very connected, but they also feel very guilty, and they feel like, and a couple students said this, every year at the Yom HaZikaron ceremony, I feel like I should go to the army, but I don't want to go to the army, and they're embarrassed to admit that because that's, right? And then said, but I really want to do, and I don't know what. So what are the other options? What does it mean to be responsible? What do you think? Do you all agree that it's like politics or it's army, and otherwise we should just keep our mouths shut and pray? That's a caricature. There's got to be something else. Yeah.
We don't have strong youth movements here, which I think are lacking. Like the B'nai Akiva in Israel is a very strong movement, and there were others. It could be that's, if we had that here, and if those kids felt that they could do something about BDS, or about writing letters to their congresspeople even, or going on APAC conferences at the high school level, maybe that would be something positive and they could get involved to show support for Israel here. But certainly a lot of people are organizing to show support for everyone else.
Okay. Good, and we do work on initiatives like that in the school. What else? Yeah.
Shift from the people of Israel and shift to Or L'Goyim, a light unto the nations. It also has to do the way you conduct yourself in business, what you advocate for, and everybody else who's out there in the real world, how you treat your neighbors. Those are all, if you're openly Jewish, then those are all very important aspects, particularly if you're not living in a totally dense Jewish area.
Correct.
Riveted.
One of the things that has come up in this school, in these conversations, is also that what we would love for kids and adults to be able to participate in is more work together, partnership work with Israelis. Because what has happened every time an Israeli, comes to this school, as principals come all the time to take a tour to see what SIR is like, and they're really startled by many of the things that we're able to do. And I have the same experience when I go to Israel and see with very different challenges and opportunities what they're able to do. And when we start to have a conversation about our joint effort, if you're talking to a teacher or a principal in a religious school, of trying to transmit these texts and these ideas that are hard to own and embrace in the modern world, we got to share those problems with different challenges and different strategies and solutions. If we are working in partnership with Israelis, and this is far beyond education, name the industry, right? That's actually a way to cultivate an awareness of and work towards strengthening the Jewish people, right? BDS and all the ways that our kids are being sent off to campuses aware of and hopefully better prepared to talk about, but that's still making them into kinds of soldiers, right? It's still, and that the military imagery has now been borrowed, and we're putting that at times on our kids now and say, go and be a chayal. Maybe it's channeling some of that, right? But there, yes, and then more, right? And so if Yom HaZikaron could eventually become a ceremony that would instill and inspire that sense of greater responsibility, right, then we're looking at a very different kind of outcome.
I think when you say us and them and you create that sort of disconnect, you can't have any kind of critical thinking, any kind of dialogue, any kind of anything. You become limited here, and they look at you in a limited way. And it should be about the collective minds coming together. Everybody is on the same page ultimately. They want what's best for Israel, its survival, its thriving, and all that.
Great. We are out of time for today. What I didn't get to do that we'll start with next week, just to give you a sense, and the last page, you're probably all familiar with this in one way or another, the last 2 pages rather, is a very famous poem by Natan Alterman, which in Israel is used in nearly every Yom HaZikaron Tekes. We actually had it in the school this year. I don't remember it in the past. It's called, The Silver Platter. It was written in 1947. And I want to study it with you and think with you about why today in Israel there is conversation about why are we still reading this poem, and the resistance that people have to changing the use of the poem gets back to this question of How do you really change a ceremony once it has staying power, once people come to expect and anticipate certain kinds of emotions and music and all the rest that come together with the ceremony? This is both a part of and symbolic of the challenges that recreating or reshifting a ceremony would engender. So if you are nervous that you're going to lose it, you know what, I'll just reprint it on next week's source sheet, so no anxieties. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.